each and every day. 'Cause honey, nothing can ever change this love I have for you. Make me weep, and you can make me cry. See me coming, and you can pass me by. But honey, nothing can ever change this love I have for you. Lord, you're the apple of my eye, your cherry pie, and oh, your cake and ice cream, and all your sugar and spice, and everything nice. You're the girl of my dreams. But if you wanted to leave me and roam, when you got back, I'd just say welcome home. 'Cause honey, nothing can ever change this love I have for you. Nothing can ever change the love I have for you.
Hi, welcome everybody. Look how you all got quiet just because I walked up here. Welcome. I'm so excited to welcome you all to this conversation. I'm so looking forward to hearing these two great leaders in science talk about their work. I'm especially excited that they are both women in neuroscience, and in fact, as President Berger-Sweeney pointed out yesterday, there's quite a lot of overlaps between both their histories and their research and their training. So I think this should be an incredibly rich and interesting conversation. Before I get started, I just want to point out once again the posters around the room and also outside in the hallway that represent the science being done here at Trinity right now, producing the next great Kaja LeWinn, perhaps. So please take advantage of checking out all the work that's going on. I know I learned a lot, even though I think I sort of know what's happening. It's my pleasure to introduce both of these scientists and leaders. Joanne Berger-Sweeney was inaugurated as the 22nd president of Trinity College, the first African American and the first woman to serve as president of the college since it was founded in 1823. Since becoming president in 2014, she has overseen innovative initiatives and partnerships, including the college's strategic plan, which guided Trinity toward the bicentennial in 2023, the creation of a mentoring program for first-year students, the launch of a campus initiative promoting inclusiveness and respect, and the development of a new innovative campus in downtown Hartford. President Berger-Sweeney serves on numerous boards in the Hartford region and beyond, including Hartford Healthcare, where she serves as the board chair, the Connecticut Conference of Independent Colleges, for which she is the past chair, and the Capital Region Development Authority. Before coming to Trinity, she served as the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Tufts University. She was the Aline Loomis Russell Professor in Neuroscience at Wellesley, where she also received an undergraduate degree in psychobiology. She received an NPH in Environmental Health Sciences from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD in neurotoxicology from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, where she did a proof of concept work on razidine, one of the most widely used Alzheimer's drugs in the world. It is also my pleasure to introduce you once again to Dr. Kaja LeWinn. Kaja is an epidemiologist and professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences in the Child and Adolescent Division of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco. She graduated from Trinity College in 1998 with a bachelor's in neuroscience, graduating Phi Beta Kappa. She then completed both her master's and doctoral work in social epidemiology at the Harvard University School of Public Health and did a postdoctoral fellow at the Robert Wood Johnson Health and Society Scholars Program and Clinical Services Research Training Program, both at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. LeWinn's primary focus of research is on how adverse effects during early childhood can influence the development of psychobiology in pediatric populations. Her extensive research and publications integrate methodologies and approaches from epidemiology, psychology, and neuroscience, and includes neuroimaging and epidemiological-based studies. She's been the primary leader on a number of large studies, including the CANDLE study, which includes over 60,000 US children and their parents. She has authored over 130 peer-reviewed publications, and her work has been featured in The Atlantic, NPR, Fortune, and other news outlets. So please welcome both of these to the stage.
Hello.
Hello.
And welcome. So I think this is supposed to be a conversation, but I will get started with a question, and maybe we can just go back and forth.
Sounds great.
And then we will leave time at the end for questions from any of you, just in case you didn't get to ask all your questions yesterday. So I thought I would start with this one. What was your experience in moving from working in someone else's lab to running your own lab and on to other leadership positions that you've had in science? Can you talk a little bit about how you navigated some of those transitions?
Well, that's a good question. It's interesting. In epidemiology, we don't have quite the same traditional lab structure. So even when I was training, even as a doctoral, in my first fellowship through the Robert Johnson Foundation, I was working with folks, but it was actually kind of almost more of a collaboration even then. And in part because I was doing interdisciplinary work, I had kind of several mentors. And so I think I actually, in some ways, feel like I was more independent almost a little too early, if that makes sense. So I actually kind of was kind of figuring it out a bit on my own, certainly with mentorship, but it wasn't like being in someone's lab, where I just kind of was following a path for a while. And then, so I was kind of charting my own path, which I think in the end worked out, but there was definitely some time where I wasn't sure it was going to work out. It's a kind of an early stage to be kind of figuring it out on your own. So I think it maybe took me a little while longer to get started, but then I think kind of that experience of kind of having to figure out how to fund certain ideas or, developing career development awards that, were maybe integrating several different disciplines. I think that set me up really well for the leadership roles I do have now. But I was like a bit of a late bloomer in a way, it kind of like took me a little bit of time. So yeah, I think that transition, I think for me it was more about transitioning to kind of being successfully independent, being able to fund myself and get my own grants as PI, and a little bit less about kind of that lab transition, But yeah, so those are some of the ways that I did that. A little bit, I would say it's a little unusual of a trajectory.
I hear you. I will share a little bit about my transition because some of it was very thoughtful. So I was in graduate school. I was in a traditional bench lab. And then I went to Paris to do my postdoc. I did my postdoc in electrophysiology. Also, lab work, bench work is what I did. And I loved living in Paris. I loved working in Paris. But it is a very different structure for science.
Interesting.
And it is very hierarchical, where there is the head of the lab, which often has, 100 people in it, let's say, and the head of the lab very much determines what is going to happen in different subsections of the lab. And I tell people that I loved living in Paris. I had a great time there. At the same time, it was clear to me that if I wanted to have my own lab and really think about my own research questions, that was not the place to do it. And when you looked at lab heads, not surprisingly, in the 1990s, they were virtually all men. And I thought, this is a much harder system to move up in as a female.
Yeah, and actually, your reflections kind of made me reflect on my experience a little bit differently, and just also to have a lot of gratitude that, in that fellowship that I had right after my doctoral work, there was this really big emphasis on kind of making us independent. Like that was their intention, right? So it wasn't, no one there was trying to keep us in their lab or have us do their work. They were trying to kind of set us up, and I think that's actually it was very lucky, I don't think, I know there were lots of other ways that could have gone, so, and I think that's actually a lot of, that fellowship was led by many visionaries, kind of in the social epi field. There were economists that were a part of it. It was very interdisciplinary. So hearing you say that makes me realize, how fortunate I was to kind of have folks, mentoring me that were really kind of pushing me out through there.
It's true. And I remember, so at the time, and I was much more familiar with what was happening in Europe, so I'm not going to pretend that this is true all over the world, but a lot of European labs were losing some of their best people to the US because they could be independent or more independent in the US, and there just weren't those mechanisms in the more traditional universities and research entities in Europe.
Yeah.
So they actually started creating programs to allow for more of their best scientists to stay in the country because they realized how important independence is in those early creative years as a scientist.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a really off-the-wall question.
Okay.
That was stimulated actually by something I was saying. Do you think that you have become more creative the further you are in your career?
Oh.
Or do you think that creative surge comes pretty much when you're almost as young as some of the students in our audience? What do
that
you
is
think?
such a great question. And then I definitely want to
fair.
hear what you have to say too. So I've been thinking about this a lot since I've been wandering around, kind of the halls of my youth. And I do feel like there's just something about this time where, I don't know, I really do feel like my brain was on fire. I mean, it was just like the connections were just happening all over the place across all of these different kind of disciplines and, classes that I was taking. And it was just this really, really rich intellectual time. And I don't think that I have felt that level of just kind of absolute engagement, which I do think is probably related to brain development, quite frankly. I mean, I just, things kind of change, your pathways kind of get more focused as you age, right? So there's biology behind that. But I will say that what's interesting is that I think what happened to me, at least, is that there was this wonderful kind of like early time, and then there was kind of like from doctoral work on, it was like the getting it together time. Like you just had to kind of do some things and get some things done to kind of make it to like what were a lot of next steps that were kind of well laid out for you. And so it was kind of a very focused, I would say more strategic time. And it's almost like kind of now in this phase where I feel a little more set up and like a little bit less like I'm just kind of hoping no one makes me leave my job, that I feel like I can kind of go back to kind of some of these more creative kind of, maybe like higher risk questions, because I feel like I have a little bit more security. I don't feel like, unfortunately, even though I'm kind of going back to that time a little bit more, I don't feel the same kind of like incredible, I think I was just feeling the plasticity of my own mind, but it's kind of a trade-off with knowing so much more. I mean, I have so much experience and I've had worked with so many different kinds of people. And so I think the kind of creativity is different, but I do feel like there is kind of a bit of a sine wave. So I'm curious what your experience has been with that.
It's quite similar.
Yeah.
As I was listening to you, it was really resonating with me. I do think there's some excitement, energy that comes with being very young. And your desire and ability to work incredibly long hours focused on particular issues. And there was just, a vibrancy in the labs when I was younger. And I kept looking for that as I was getting, older and older. But I'm not sure I've ever had that kind of energy or excitement in quite the same way. And I would say peaking maybe around sometime in graduate school.
I think that's exactly right.
And then you are taking fewer risks. I was glad you were using that word, because I think you were quite right about that.
Yeah, I think things do change when you start doing things like getting mortgages, and things that you have to, commit to. And so, So
Absolutely.
there's kind of a reality that sets in for a little while. And it's still an exciting time. It's different.
But it's different.
It's different. And it's nice that you brought that up too, because I do feel like the kind of searching for it a little bit, like searching for that kind of fire. And I have found myself kind of asking myself, like, why don't I feel that way anymore? Like, what am I doing wrong? But I really do think it's developmental. Like, I don't know if it's something that you get to just keep having your whole life. I think, there's a reason that we kind of go through stages even in adulthood, and so it's a little bit of a different stage, I think, that we're in.
Right.
Yeah.
So you also spoke a little bit about plasticity and plasticity of the brain. So if you were giving us all advice on what you could do early in development that would make the biggest difference, what do you think that would be for kind of that developmental plasticity that you've been talking about?
So it's interesting. The kind of one thing is a little bit hard, just picking one thing. But, I think I'll say, I would say the one thing for, very small children is, kind of really about kind of establishing that protected environment, nurturing environment, and then also kind of an environment with a lot of cognitive stimulation, right? And so I think
Now, do you mean that you should play Mozart to your
I don't think
one-year-old?
you necessarily have to. That was the
that
thing.
That was a thing
Yeah.
a while ago.
I think there's the most evidence for language exposure, right? So really just speaking a lot. I always tell young parents that you should just talk to your baby. Like, just talk to them. Just tell them whatever you're doing. And just let they may not really have any idea what you're saying, but that's okay. And so there are things like that I think really make a big difference. But I think what can get kind of tricky is that we kind of are coming up with protective influences and harms and in research all the time. And I also want to tell folks, particularly parents with young children, that not one thing is going to kind of be the deciding factor. Like children are resilient, and so I think you kind of want to focus on balancing those protective factors, right, from some of those harmful factors. And there are some things that are maybe easier to avoid, like certain chemical exposures or things like that you can maybe make some choice about. Some things you might not be able to avoid, but if you were buffering them with, a lot of, kind of love and nurturing and also kind of cognitive stimulation and kind of attending to various needs, then there's resilience there, So I think it's not just a one thing or another thing, it's kind of like the whole picture and kind of balancing out the good and some of the more harmful things that might happen.
Right. So if you could create a policy change, if you had, I don't know, $50 billion to invest into something, where would you place your bet?
So I think I would still, it's interesting, so development is, so children are not just one type of being, right? They start out as babies and there's like certain requirements and needs, and then, that changes a little bit as they become children. And, so there's not actually just one thing for all of childhood, right? But if we just focus on, kind of the very early years, there's actually some really great programs that are already shown to do wonderful things that are very evidence-based. So things like, home nursing programs that actually help parents kind of learn about infant development and help, kind of understand certain aspects of parenting and how to do some of these cognitive enriching things. Those are actually very effective, and there's a lot of, early interventions where, there's kind of some intensive, early childhood, a lot like Head Start, but just more resourced, more resourced and sort of, and more intensive and a little bit more attuned towards individual needs, So I really do think that kind of getting kids off on the right foot with a lot of investment, it really pays off. There was a graph that I wanted to show yesterday that I felt like I didn't have time for, but there's this really wonderful work by James Heckman, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, and he did this really interesting work kind of asking what is the rate of return on a human capital investment depending on when you intervene or when you do, sort of different things. And he has this really wonderful graph that basically shows that, it's the highest in the preschool years.
Absolutely.
Right? And then it just kind of, it pretty dramatically, ebbs away. And it's not that those interventions or work training programs or things like that later in life don't matter. They certainly do, and they matter a lot for individuals. But just in terms of overall return, setting folks up, with a foundation, to kind of succeed, really seems to be, the most effective thing to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. When you were talking about what's necessary very early, and of course, I always make a question much more complicated than it should be, but I started to think one of the most important things you can do is provide, I want to say, a home. And given how many people are unhoused at the moment, you wonder, how do you worry about stimulation when you aren't sure where you're sleeping that night, where, just the whole, and so much comes with a home and housing, stability, a place to go to work from. Just so much. The possibility of creating your own food and cooking yourself, as opposed to, just being subject to what's out there. But
no, I think that's so. I think that was why I was struggling with the one policy, because what I just said doesn't deal with any of the structural inequalities, right? It's just sort of like, and we can do those kinds of programs, but it's kind of assuming this sort of foundational, kind of capacity and resource. And I do think things like universal income, are like, that's. I feel like we need to consider that, in terms of ways of really, getting folks out of poverty and giving them more, support to be able to kind of engage in some of these things. This is what I had a whole laundry, I have a whole laundry list. The other thing is, our leave policies, our parental leave policies are like commensurate with, nowhere else in, kind of the Western, right? We have these really, really meager leave policies. They can be a little bit better by state, and actually right now there's a ton of state variation in leave policies with, California doing, kind of, and other states. Actually, it's great. Actually, many states are kind of joining forces, but it's not necessarily paid leave, right? And so, that's a huge thing, and that's actually a huge thing where there are huge inequalities, right? Because even though some states are mandating it more, whether or not it's even feasible to take the leave, right, really varies. So. I completely agree with you that there's still these massive inequities that we need, kind of bigger policies, that go well beyond the family and intervening on individuals, to help folks have the resources necessary to do some of these things that promote child development.
Right.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, I'll let you ask a question too.
Let's see. Well, how did you make it from Paris? Like, what was the next step? You were in Paris, drinking lattes, looking at the street culture, and then how did you get back?
So maybe I didn't share this with you the other day, but when I was in Paris, I opened a science magazine, and they were advertising for an assistant professor position at Wellesley College, which was my undergraduate institution. Now, if you would have asked me as an undergraduate, would you ever go back to Wellesley? Oh, I would have given you some smug answer like, you must be kidding. I wouldn't think about it. But I do remember at one point when I was at Hopkins, and I was, Hopkins, the whole institution is quite medically focused. And it's quite competitive, has some, I think it still is either first or second in terms of scientific money, grants from NIH. So it's a hugely competitive environment. And I remember being in an elevator with someone that I had spoken to the day before who needed something from me. And we had this great chat I was on the elevator the next day, and it's as though he didn't know me. And I remember so visually at that time saying, well, I wonder what it would be like to go back to a liberal arts institution where I'd have friends who weren't just scientists, but in other departments, and maybe I'd even get to know someone in the French department, So when I opened the magazine and saw the advertisement, I said, I wonder if I should apply for that. And I did, and I was fortunate enough to get the job, as well as some others, and I had to think about liberal arts education, do I want to be there and do science there? Do I want to be in a bigger research university? I had that option. Do I want to be in a pharmaceutical company? I had that option. And one of the things I did was I looked at who was interviewing me, and I said, which of these people can I imagine being 10 years from now? And it came back overwhelmingly Wellesley when I asked that question. Did you ever have, a kind of a moment like that where you were trying to decide where or at what level you were going to do your science and your research? And
that is so. I had a really different experience, actually, in a lot of ways. And I mean, this is so fun. Like, everything you're saying kind of makes me, reflect on different things in a different way. But for me, when I got to UCSF for my fellowships, it was kind of interesting. In a way, I felt like I was getting further away from folks that I felt more similar to. And I would say also in kind of this medical school environment, which you described really well. So that's kind of where I am. I'm basically out of Johns Hopkins right now.
Sorry.
And so, yeah, right. And I actually have really wonderful colleagues, but it is a compulsive work culture. I mean, it is a very, people, there's not really a lot of work-life balance. People are trying to find work-life balance, but it's really hard. And for the most part, I think I've actually had to make very different decisions for myself, given to some of my own values and intentions around work that make me feel very different to some of the folks that I am working with, And so it's interesting. I feel a lot of commonality, and I have great colleagues. They are very similar, so I am mostly friends at work with psychologists and some psychiatrists. I don't have, I'm not friends with anyone in the French department. We don't have one of those. So it's interesting. I do think, I do feel like that has been one of the interesting pieces of kind of developing into a more, kind of mid-career person, which is that I've kind of had to define for myself how I want to manage kind of some pretty intensive work demands, and that means, making certain choices some people might not make, and saying no to some things sometimes, and I look around and I see a lot of people who have a hard time saying no. So it sometimes makes me feel like I'm, not doing quite the right thing, but it feels good to me, So when I make those choices, I feel like I'm kind of staying true to myself, But yeah, it's interesting. Like, I have sometimes wondered, what it would be like to be in a different, environment. But I actually love so many other things about my environment that I'm in. I have a lot of autonomy. I was telling Sarah, like, I pretty much right now kind of come up with, a grant idea or something, and then I pick of my colleagues that I really enjoy working with, like, who to do that with, and then we write a grant. I mean, that's a great life, Like, so it has really wonderful sides to it too. But
so can you, now that we've started to talk a little bit about what your work life is, how would you a bit break it down by percentage? How much time do you actually spend writing the grant versus doing the research versus perhaps collaborating, what would a typical month look like for you? Because a typical day doesn't get at it, but maybe in a month, how would your time be divided up?
So it's interesting, it's a little more cyclical than that, because it's not like every month I spend, 20% grant, time writing or writing papers or mentoring, but but there is kind of the grant cycle. So when I'm in a grant cycle, it's like everyone knows they won't see me for like 3 months. Depending on how big the grant is, it might be 3 months, it might be a few weeks,
Right.
but I will just disappear. I will probably get behind on all the other things I have to do, the research that is ongoing. So that is kind of grant life. And it is kind of something that a lot of people talk about as just kind of not enjoying very much. I think I feel like I've come to a certain kind of understanding or just kind of approach that works okay for me, where I don't completely lose myself in that process, but that's part of the cycle. And then I would say if it's not a grant cycle, and I'm not, frantically trying to get something done, then I'm actually pretty much 100% research. And so, but that kind of includes, I'm a associate director of one of our T32 programs, and so I would say I spend about maybe 10% of my time on that, and that's every month. And then in terms of the leadership roles that I'm already in and kind of the grants that are ongoing, that's really the majority of my time, because that's kind of what 100% research. I'm in a soft money position, and I think for those of you that maybe don't know, in academia you can have kind of a hard money job where your salary is covered. That's what folks here have. And then in a lot of research institutions, there are soft money jobs. And that means that I have a soft money job and I bring in my own funding from grants. And so there's some flexibility that comes with that. I don't teach, but I do have to bring in, I feel like I'm my own boss. I have to kind of bring in my own money. I have to kind of fundraise. And so basically the rest of my time is being spent doing those projects that I have funding for. So if you really did the math, it would mean that my grant writing actually has to happen outside of my 40-hour work week, because my 40-hour work week is covered. So
By 100%.
by the 100% research funding, or so it is.
Yeah.
This is why there is kind of an overwork culture where I am, and there's of course other things that folks ask you to do, but I do still think there's and this is another thing with experience, you kind of you become more efficient, and I think that's one of the, maybe that's what we trade for our lack of minds on fire. We are, we're more efficient, we can get things done, we know, kind of the process. And so, so that's how I think it becomes manageable and feels more manageable at this stage. At the beginning when you're writing your first grants, you're like, how could this possibly work? But it gets easier,
Yeah.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to use that as a point to transition to ask if there are any questions out here that you would like answered. I have more questions, but I want to make sure that we also have time for you all to, yes.
Hello, Dr. LeWinn, and thank you all for your conversation today. My name is Joanne.
Oh, I think a mic is coming.
Well, thank you both for your conversation today. My name is Juan Rayo. I'm a political science student. I'm a sophomore here, and I asked a question yesterday, as a matter of fact. And though I'm a poli-sci major, I am taking a neuroscience class this semester, so some progress there. Well, I am very curious about something. Since both of you are, I would say, women in STEM, and as men of color, I have noticed like a lot of my friends who are mostly Hispanic or African American are interested in STEM, but I would say that STEM, at least here in the United States, has never been like kind to people of color, and people of color still struggle finding pathways in these majors, in these careers, So as two trailblazers, as you are, women in STEM, and in the case of the president, a woman of color in STEM, I'm curious about what you think we could do to improve the access that people of color have to careers in STEM, like neuroscience or engineering, that kind of STEM fields. Thank you.
Excellent question. I'm definitely going to defer to you on that one first.
Well, I'll start one place, and then maybe there are some other things that you want to say. But so I was a faculty member at Wellesley College and I went through assistant, associate, and full professor. And one of the reasons I actually moved into administration was that I realized that in a given year, in the biology department at Wellesley College, I could generally count the women of color Black and Latina in my classes on one hand. And I taught hundreds of students each year. And that's about how many I saw. And so I thought about moving into administration because I wanted to change that. And there are probably lots of things that I could say that you have to change an entire ecosystem to really have an influence. But one thing I was absolutely sure would make a difference was if we could bring more people of color as STEM faculty members, where students could see themselves in those positions. I was certain that that would make a difference. And so every institution that I've been associated with, whether it was Wellesley College, Tufts University, or here, I have always had a focus on increasing the number of people of color in the faculty, because I know students need to see that to imagine themselves as scientists. It's not the only thing I did, but I think it's a really important part of creating that ecosystem that I'm talking about, because when faculty members come to a place like this, they are more than likely there for 25, 35, 40 years. And that is how you really start to influence and change a system. So that was one thing that I have carried through all of the institutions where I've been, and I hope that it's made a difference.
Great. Yeah, you've done wonderful work. It's really wonderful to see kind of the changes since I was here, certainly massive changes, but also just reading about what has happened in the last 11 years is really wonderful. And I think from where I sit, at UCSF and in the psychiatry department, we actually have a kind of a diversity committee and set of practices that are actually kind of well regarded kind of across the university. And a lot of what we are doing in a lot of ways is very similar, is really just trying to both recruit and retain people of color and just to make a more diverse faculty. We've had really big challenges with first, we didn't, basically our women who are kind of getting into higher positions were leaving. So, we're trying to work on retention there. And then also really trying to support folks of color that are starting out early, and so that we can kind of keep them and retain them. So there are a lot of fellowships that are available. There are very particular awards and things that are designed to help, kind of keep folks at UCSF. But it is a big challenge. For us, we started out by kind of mapping the problem, so that was many years ago. There was our department was actually much less diverse, and we kind of did this equity review, and there were a lot of things to fix. And so, that was kind of the beginning of a long trajectory of both kind of thinking about, pay equity, and then also kind of this issue of really having our faculty better reflect kind of, the community that we were in. And so it's been an ongoing process, but I do think, we're making some progress, and there's some really committed folks. We've had wonderful leadership from women of color at UCSF too, really pushing forward a lot of these initiatives, and they have a lot of support from folks like me and other folks that really just want to see those changes happen. So
I think one of the things that you said yesterday also was that different people as scientists will ask different scientific questions. And so, have you been able to influence that a bit by, bringing more people into the scientific field? So they're asking different kinds of, you are asking different questions than scientists a generation ago asked.
Yes, yeah. And I think, I feel like what you're getting at is, maybe in part what what kind of having a diverse faculty does in terms of kind of the questions that are asked. And you know, I will say that so in my mentorship role, in our T32, which is a postdoctoral training program funded by the NIH, we actually do an incredible amount to make sure that we are recruiting, you know, people of color, and certainly, you know, folks that may be the first in their family, you know, to complete college, or, you know, things like that, so that we can have those diverse perspectives. And certainly, you know, some of the, I think these questions that I have been interested in for a long time about inequalities, you know, I mean, these are questions that really, you know, it's like having folks with lived experience, you know, consider and ask, you know, research questions, and also really, you know, empowering those folks to, you know, think about, you know, how we can make a difference, and also, you know, to kind of, you know, help them along their way, I think is a huge part of, you know, really getting at some of these important questions, and bringing in some new ideas, you know, that maybe aren't obvious.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Any other questions out there? Oh, I see one there and one there, so.
Hello, how are you? I had a question just in general about, I'm considering in, you know, my post-grad maybe doing research at some point. So I know that research is not always like a linear path, you know, you can have roadblocks, or, you know, like just things that get in your way.
Yeah.
Do you have any general tips about if you face a setback, or you maybe are in a rut, just for what to do?
Oh, it's a really good question. Do you, I guess I would say, you know, rely on your network and the people that care about you. I think, and I guess another thing is just to normalize ruts. So there are definitely ruts, and there are definitely times where things do not, you know, necessarily go from A to B to C to D, you know, in a perfectly linear fashion. You know, I talked a little bit about my father passing away my junior year. Like, that was a, you know, really destabilizing event. And so I think the key thing is to, I think, you know, be kind to yourself. You know, we're all human, and life will happen to us, and you know, we just kind of have to cope as best we can. And then I think also just, you know, rely on the folks that care about you. You know, reach out, ask for help. You know, I think there are a lot of resources here. I think as I left Trinity, I continued to be very lucky to be surrounded by, you know, other resources, both in the institutions I was in, but also just in kind of, you know, family members or friends of family members, and, you know, just reach out and ask for help, ask for advice. You know, I mean, it is totally fine not to know what to do next. That's just part of development, you know. So, so just be kind to yourself, and, you know, kind of ask for some assistance. And we have all done that many times. You know, there's nobody who's made it through life without some hiccups, you know. What would you say, Joanne? Would you add anything?
Well, I realized, you know, my career was a little bit different in being at a liberal arts institution. But one trick I had, since my job was teaching, research, and administration, if one thing was frustrating me, I'd do the other. It's like I would just be all in on teaching when some experiment was just frustrating me. I just needed a break, and then to be able to come back to it, and, you know, vice versa. So sometimes it's also knowing yourself well enough to set up different things where you'll get satisfaction when one thing perhaps isn't going so well.
That's actually, that made me think of something. That was such a great point. I think the kind of related to that in terms of getting stuck is that, you know, one thing that can happen, especially early on, is you can invest a lot in like a single project. Like, you might have one project, you know, or you might be, and that's a little tricky, because if things are not going well in that one project, it's like you're kind of stuck. So, you know, even just diversifying what you're doing, and like just kind of trying some different things. Like, it means that if one thing is not really going so well, there's probably a couple other things that you feel good about or more excited about. And so that balance is something that it took me a while to figure out, but it's been really helpful for exactly what you just said. You know, it's not going well here, but this is still really fun, so I'm going to do this for a while, you know. That's great advice.
And there was another question there.
Thank you both for this great conversation. Dr. LeWinn, you've had such a unique scientific perspective kind of throughout your research career. Were there any challenges with initially pursuing this very interdisciplinary approach?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I had a really, it's interesting. I was not very productive early on, so I think one thing about being interdisciplinary at a very young age is that I think it makes the likelihood of having major imposter syndrome like even worse, right? It's already bad, but it's even worse because you just kind of feel like you don't know anything that well, you're like, this a bit and you're working with this person, but you haven't necessarily just gone really deep in that one thing, and you're kind of watching all these other people go really deep into that one thing and knowing literally everything about it. And so I kind of I had a bit of time, particularly like in my fellowship and then a little bit into my assistant professorship, where I just was kind of like a little overwhelmed, and I wasn't really sure where to kind of put my money. And, there were lots of questions in my head. And so I do think it was a difficult path. And I think I kind of describe it as more of like a late blooming path. It was like, I think during all of those early kind of starting times, it was like kind of there was a bit of a synthesis happening in terms of like what I thought was really meaningful and where I really wanted to invest my time. But it took quite a bit longer than if I just, kind of stayed the traditional course. So I do think it is unique in that, and I was kind of fortunate that people were still willing to keep me around while I wasn't, necessarily producing at the level that I think was necessarily expected, right? And I think that was part of the benefit of being in that very interdisciplinary fellowship, is that I think they kind of knew it was going to take us a little while. We weren't necessarily going to write 10 papers in our fellowship because we were kind of figuring things out. So yeah, it was challenging and it felt a little risky, but it's nice to kind of be here and feel like, hey, it worked out. So
Yeah, absolutely. I think Susan Massino, you have the mic, and probably you get the last question because, it is a day where people have to go to classes, so I'm trying to keep to the 1:15 hard stop.
Yes, I'll make this on. Yes. Thank you so much to both of you for being such trailblazers, and also for explicitly saying it's so important to ask the right questions, which is critical. I wanted to ask sort of a follow-up from your presentation yesterday when you were talking about the socioeconomic challenges and caregivers during the pandemic. And I had a question about that because that all feeds into, childhood issues and sequelae. And I was wondering if the challenges that were differentiated socioeconomically, were those an exacerbation of pre-pandemic issues, or were those new things that showed up during the pandemic? Or was there baseline data on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that is, essentially the takeaway from the pandemic experience is that it really just showed us what was already happening, right? It was more just like, I think because everyone became under such a strain, it was sort of like these kind of inequities, you kind of, not that they could be ignored before, but they just sort of were, and then we had this pandemic that really just amplified everything because, the only way to kind of cope with the pandemic was to rely on, kind of resources that you had built up, savings, flexibility, things that actually you really suddenly needed, and not just for like a week, you needed them for months and months and months. And so, yes, to your point, like all of the things, that were disparate were true prior to the pandemic. It's just that during the pandemic, like folks that were kind of managing to kind of keep it together, despite, having two jobs, all of these different challenges, like suddenly there's no childcare, there's no school, and that's kind of like this, there's just no way to kind of cope at that point. So yes, I think for a lot of folks, in my world, we were not surprised, right? Like we sort of expected to see that would be much harder for folks without resources. But I think for kind of the wider, certainly in the media, you saw a lot about this. It kind of, I think, called some of the social disparities in those experiences, really, it called them to the forefront in a way that, they hadn't been in the past. But yes, exactly.
Okay,
Yeah,
I have
follow-up. Yeah.
a tiny follow-up question. So I know your big data sets are on very young children and brain development and adversity. And I'm wondering if those data sets could possibly provide clues, given that large system change is not going to come easily.
Yeah.
Could you possibly pull out of those data sets factors that may be mitigating as the children get older, whether it's time outside or a mentor or nutrition or sleep schedules, all of those kinds of things? Can we start to figure out ways to kind of promote personal resilience and mitigate those early factors? And are your studies designed to do that? And if they aren't, maybe you can figure out a way now to pull that data out. That's just my last point.
Yeah, no, they definitely are. So, in my 30 minutes, I, kind of wanted to give a high-level overview of just a few things that felt like interesting points. But there's tons of data in that massive, and all of our studies actually, that are actually sources of resilience. So, you've heard of ACEs, but there's also now, I'm not exactly sure how you say it all together, but it's BCE, beneficial childhood experiences. So, and we look at sleep and we measure sleep. We also measure sort of, positive aspects of family dynamics. And so those data sets are very, if you're not familiar as much with these like big omnibus cohort studies, like there's just a massive amount of things we ask families. And there are many, many positive, resilience-oriented factors, and folks are looking at that a lot. I know you care about green space. There's a quite widely cited paper that came out from that largest consortium looking at the relationship between green space and mental health, and essentially like across the country finding this positive association between more green space and reductions in behavior problems. So yes, definitely lots of opportunities to look at positive things too. So thanks for that.
So thank you. Please join me in saying thank you to Dr. Kaja LeWinn and congratulating her on the Trinity College President's Medal for Science and Innovation. We are so proud and so glad that you came back to join us.
Thank you. I'm so honored. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for coming.
For the